We have the pleasure of being joined by Evan Miyakawa, college basketball analyst. And Evan, I've been going through your website for the entire college basketball season and going through all the different statistics that you run. But how's your college basketball season been so far?
Man, I think this season has been about as exciting as any in the first, 6 weeks of the season or so. There's a lot of different teams that have a claim to be the best in the country, and there's been more like high profile games, top 25, top 15 matchups than I think we've seen in a long time this early in the season in the non-conference. There's been a lot of storylines. It's been great, so I've been really enjoying it.
Yeah,
Evan,
before we get into the season as a whole, just going back to kind of how you got into basketball analytics and kind of how much has basketball analytics kind of become basically, a big part of the college basketball game in the last ten or so years.
Yeah, sure. So, just for a little bit of background, my background is in stats and sports analytics, but my favorite sport my entire life has been college basketball. I have my PhD in statistics, which I got from Baylor, and so a couple years ago, while I was in grad school, initially kind of as a side project, I created this college basketball analytics website. But it's organically grown over the last several years to the point where it's now used by tons of coaches, journalists, and media and fans as well for analyzing the sport. And I was able to leave my previous job doing like statistical consulting for NBA teams to focus full time on the college side of things, which is great. And so, the site covers a lot of things, team and player performance. Lineup analysis during the season is a really big thing coaches use it for. Come the off season and the transfer portal, there's a lot of different tools people use for evaluating transfers. Mine's one of the most popular ones. And so a lot of coaches around the country are using it for that. So really a lot of different things going on.
and Evan, for someone like me, I love the game of basketball. I love sports. The analytics, the stats, I'm not a huge numbers person. So when I go onto your website, it's awesome. It's got all this stuff on it, but it can be a little overwhelming, I think, for me and just kind of that neutral fan. So like, what are some key things that you think just the average, viewer of college basketball should look at, be like, hey, look, these things are really important to base how well your team's performing?
Sure. So the main two pages that you can hit just for free are player ratings and team ratings. So team ratings basically says going forward from this point in time, how good does my statistical model think each team is going to be? And so when you see Auburn at number one, that's not me just saying Auburn has been the best team so far this season. It's saying going forward, I think they're the best team, the most likely team probably to win a national championship. And so as you're watching your own team and seeing them go up or down, in that team ratings, you can kind of get a sense for, are they trending in the right direction or the wrong direction? And how do they compare to other teams in Division One or in their conference? And then the player ratings is kind of just an extension of that, where basically I'm valuing every single player in the country based on how impactful they are to their team when they're on the court. Whether that's a 30-point per game or a 3-point per game scorer, like every single player has their own function. And so my player metric basically values your importance to your team on offense and defense. And so when you look at that leaderboard, that will often give you a good sense of like, hey, here are the players on my team that I follow that are being much more valuable, and here are the players who are kind of struggling. And you can split that into offense and defense. But that's kind of where I would start, with sort of getting a flavor for where your team is at.
Speaking of offense, defense, and individual players, how has Syracuse done in terms of the way that your analytics work in terms of offense and some individual players that stand out on Syracuse roster?
Yeah, I think when I was looking at Syracuse in the preseason, I think they were 60th in the country, which is like outside the at-large picture, but definitely with room to get in. And in terms of how I've done this season, their offense has been pretty much on par for what was expected, but their defense has been a struggle. I think they're ranked outside the top 150 in the country in predicted defensive performance, basically, by the team, which has been a big step down from where I projected them in the preseason. So I think that's probably the biggest glaring error for this team, is that offensively they're doing fine, but defensively it's been a struggle, and they haven't really figured that part out yet.
Do you think that's based off of a certain player that's the problem, the scheme in which they're playing the defense, or is it just kind of a general issue that maybe needs a season to resolve itself?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know Syracuse basketball well enough to know schematically what they're doing, but I definitely don't think it's just one player. I think across the board, it's kind of just been, I mean, often as is the case with defense, it's not typically one guy's fault. It's the whole system, right? And so you can't necessarily rely on one player defensively like you can on offense. And so, I think that just probably across the board. Now, certainly there are always things you can do to optimize, like, hey, we need to play these players more and these players less because we don't have as many defensive holes or that sort of thing. And obviously defensive chemistry between players matters a lot in terms of, hey, these two players play really well. They have good communication. So certainly all that stuff matters, but I'm sure you could probably point fingers in a number of different directions.
I'm curious, how does your analytics take into account, the difference in positions? I know, since Steph Curry came into the league too, a lot of times teams are taking a lot more threes because it's a more efficient way of playing basketball, eliminating the mid range as they call it. At least at Rutgers, they're trying to do that this season with Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper. How do you kind of differentiate between, a center's efficiency rating versus like a guard's efficiency rating?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, even though you have a point guard and a center play different roles, they're still allowed to do the same things on the court, right? And so I basically look at two different things when evaluating a player's sort of defensive value. The first is we can get a decent sense of how good a player is defensively based on their individual defensive stats. So, defensive rebounds, blocks, steals, etc. But that only goes a small percentage of the way to actually figuring out like who's actually really good, because a lot of times big men will rack up those stats. You could get lots of defensive rebounds and blocks and stuff, and guards typically don't do that. But guards are just as important to your defense as centers because everyone has an important role to play. And so what really matters more is just when you're on the court, how well is the team playing defensively when you're there? How are you impacting your team's defensive performance? If you're on the court and the team is playing better defensively, that's great. If you're on the court and the team's playing worse defensively, that's bad. And so a lot of what my model does is take all that context, looks at every possession that a player plays and sees how well is the team performing defensively, but it adjusts for a lot of contextual factors that can kind of add noise there, like how good are the other players on the court with you? If you're always put to guard the other team's best player, you'll get more credit for that defensively than if you're always playing against the bench unit on the other team. Or similar for your own team too. If you're always playing with good players versus bad players in your own team, it adjusts for that as well. And so that's really a big part of quantifying who's good defensively. It's ultimately like people have been trying to accurately measure defensive value for years, and it's still a tough task, but I think my metric defensive Bayesian performance rating is probably as close as you can get to doing a pretty good job of summing that up across, over 5,000 players in Division I basketball.
So, when you mention all the, looking at more advanced stats and whatnot, one thing that people always say if a player has a bad game or a good game is like, oh, look at the plus minus. For me, like that's like, oh, well, is that really that accurate? How much are you weighing the plus minus stat?
Basically, what I'm doing is a version of what they call advanced plus minus or adjusted plus minus. And basically, what I would sort of say is plus minus at a single game level is not really that helpful because there's going to be a lot of noise from game to game. If a guy's -6, like, you don't really take too much stock in that. Even for a whole season, which I do track, whole season plus minus, it's only so helpful. And there's a lot of just like, if you're on a good team, you're going to have a good plus minus. And if you're on a bad team, you're going to have a bad plus minus. So a lot of what I do is actually adjust for, okay, what are the problems with plus minus? Like there's 5 players on the court and they're all going to get the same credit defensively, no matter who actually made the play. Right. And so a lot of what I do is adjust for a lot of those factors and adjust for the context of when you're playing a game and who you're playing with, and not just the strength of the team that you're playing, but the strength of individual players that you're matched up against. And then you aggregate that across a whole season. And then you also can even look at a player's historical performance in previous seasons. And all of that goes into building one number that's going to predict their defensive performance going forward. And so once you have all of that information, it gets a lot more accurate than just looking at raw plus minus, if that makes sense.
I know so we have this one longtime reporter in Syracuse that's been reporting on the team since the 90s. So basically the primetime Jim Boeheim years. And he talks about looking towards the NCAA tournament and, getting to about the new year before you look towards, what teams have a chance, who's on the bubble. Does Syracuse have a chance to make the tournament kind of thing? In terms of a statistics sense, when you look at these teams that play, hard non-conference schedules, a team like a Maryland who Syracuse is playing a little bit of an easier non-conference schedule. How do you kind of weigh that in terms of where in the season are you looking at teams analytically like, okay, this team is on the bubble or can make the NCAA tournament?
I mean, I certainly think at this point in the season, we have a pretty good idea of probably the 20 to 25 teams will kind of be fighting to make it in at the bubble spot. Obviously, there's going to be some teams within conference play that probably rise 30 spots or fall 30 spots from where they are right now nationally. But, we have a pretty good sense of like what teams are in between that, say, like 10 to 90% range of like they could or could not make the tournament. But with that being said, like, especially for teams that haven't played high majors, who haven't played that good of competition, those are the matches that really matter to the selection committee. And obviously you don't want to drop bad losses against bad teams, like that hurts you as well. But, for teams like, say, an Ole Miss or Mississippi State, who have not played as many good teams, even though the analytics really like them, in terms of building their resume for the tournament, it's really going to matter a lot more what they do in January than what they've done so far, because they don't really have that many marquee wins. Whereas you look at a team like Auburn, for example, and they've already beaten like 4 or 5 really, really good teams. Even if they drop some games in conference play, they've already built a good resume of wins. And so I think for those teams who have already played a lot of harder competition, we can have a more accurate sense of where they'll end up in the bracket compared to teams who have sort of saved a lot of their big games for conference play.
Evan, another kind of new term that was floated to me this season was kill shots. The whole 10-0 run thing. And Syracuse's opponent this weekend, Maryland, is one of the better teams at kill shots. How much do you look at that statistic in determining, your analytical basis?
Yeah, so a kill shot is defined as any time that a team scores 10 or more unanswered points. And I started tracking this a couple seasons ago because it's a really good way of measuring sort of a team's like streakiness or building momentum or like kind of a spurtability in a game. And so teams that often have these 10-0 runs or kill shots are often able to kind of flip the script of a game really quickly. If they're down, they can easily be ahead, or if the game's close, they can put it out of reach. And then you have teams who give up a lot of kill shots, who often are sort of not safe with a lead, or, just in general can be in games that are kind of back and forth all the time. And so you mentioned Maryland, and actually they lead the country in kill shots per game. They have almost over 1.5 a game. So in other words, more often than not, they're going to have a 10-0 run in a game, and oftentimes they'll have 2 or more. And they've only conceded 3 of these so far this season. So they're basically, no lead is safe when you're playing Maryland, because they could easily just go on a run and put it away. And that's certainly something that teams are scared of. That was certainly a big trademark of UConn last year in the Elite Eight. I think they had a 30-0 run to put away Illinois for good, and that was a thing that a lot of teams were scared of. That at any point UConn could just wrestle this thing away from you. So very interesting to track, and Maryland has been one of the best teams in the country so far this year at doing it.
Yeah, Maryland was down 21-17 to St. Francis on Tuesday, and then they went on a 38-8 run to end the first half to take a commanding lead. You mentioned UConn and the success that they've had in terms of kill shots in the years past. Have you noticed a correlation between kill shot success versus winning, especially in the tournament?
Yeah, I've done some studying of this, and basically there's kind of a threshold where I can't quote the exact numbers right now, but if teams that have won the national championship or made the Final Four in the last like 10 years have often been above a certain threshold in going on 10-0 runs. But then I think even more importantly, they've been really solid on not conceding 10-0 runs. And so there's a kind of a certain sort of title threshold that most teams, if not all teams in the last 10 years have been in terms of, being able to put a team away, but certainly not giving up leads easily. And that's been a certain a trademark of success for those teams. So certainly something to watch going forward.
So Evan, when the bracket gets laid out, is it, really big, to look at those analytics to really predict matchups better? When if I'm filling out my bracket and if I want that perfect bracket, should I lean towards these analytics to help me get those matchups right?
I think the thing that people are always looking for is not just like who could win the whole thing, but specifically like, how does this team versus this team specifically, this could be more ripe for an upset than if they played a different team, right? And so there's always those matchup specific things you're looking at. And actually one of the cool things that you can do on my website, which is really helpful come March, is there's a hypothetical game prediction sort of matchup preview that you can generate. So when the bracket comes out and you're saying, okay, I want to see what would this 9 seed look like for this is 1 seed in the second round, you can actually like put those teams in and see not just the predicted score, but like the strengths and weaknesses of each team and why it's being predicted a certain way. And so I think that's a really fun way of sort of going through and matchup by matchup deciding who you think should go through.
That's awesome. That actually sparks another question in my mind in terms of the net ranking has been a big topic of conversation in college basketball the last couple of years, especially in the ACC, especially the last couple of years in terms of non-conference play, not winning those non-conference games, which lowers the overall conference's kind of net ranking and makes those conference games a little bit in terms of quads less important. So I guess how much does your analytics coincide with the net rankings? Like, have they matched up? Or are you a fan of the net ranking?
I think by the end of the season, they'll be pretty close. One thing that's different about mine is that I always am sort of forward looking in terms of predicting how well a team is doing, whereas net ranking is purely trying to say how good has your season been so far. And so, in that sense, there's always going to be some disagreement. But I basically don't care at all about the net ranking until you get to probably February. And the reason is because when you only have like a quarter or a third of the season played so far, which is where we're at right now, there's just not enough games for it to confidently know who's really good and who's really not. And that's why you're going to see some teams who are weaker teams towards the top, because they might have beaten a bad team, but the net ranking doesn't have any information about how these teams are supposed to be going into the season. So it might think the team that they beat is actually a good team. So in that sense, I don't really put a lot of stock into it because teams are going to kind of move towards where they really should be by about February or so. And that's when you really start to pay attention to it in terms of roughly where does a team's resume rank compared to other teams that might be in the tournament.
Evan, last one for me. It's just kind of a, from your side of it, this to me, just from the outside, seems all kind of confusing. Of course, you've done a great job simplifying it, and your website, I think, definitely helps people. But for you, how rewarding is it when you get those coaches or those scouts who are like, hey, like your website really helped me in evaluating this player and whatnot?
Yeah, it's really cool. I think that's one of the most fun parts of the job is building relationships with people who are, trying to get an edge or, for example, in the transfer portal, right? Most teams are quickly trying to decide on players within a matter of days or a week or two once a player enters the portal. And so a tool like my transfer portal projections can really help filter down players that a team's looking at, for example. And so being able to help people use that and find success has been really cool. And obviously, there's lots of different levels of complexity to it, but something that I really enjoy doing is taking complicated technical ideas, that I work on a daily basis and trying to explain it in a way that regardless of what level of understanding that you have, that you can appreciate and use it in some form. Because, there are a lot of people who love to be in the weeds with the math and the statistics and all that, but there are also a lot of people who just want to enjoy college basketball and just get a little bit more understanding of the game without getting too deep into it. And so I really enjoy kind of talking all across that spectrum and making it easy for other people to understand, both for coaches and for fans, etc. So I always really enjoy doing that.
Yeah, the transfer portal, big, especially in the last couple of years in terms of college basketball, transforming rosters from year to year. Syracuse just actually hired their first full-time analytics staffer, and I know he's talked about the transfer portal is no longer a guessing game. You got to be able to really pinpoint the guys you need for your roster. Evan, where can people find your work, your website, everything throughout the rest of the college basketball season?
Yeah. Yeah, my website is evanmiya.com, EVANMIYA. That's where you can find a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today. I've got links to all my different social media platforms on there as well. I'm super active on Twitter if you use that. So yeah, that's the main place where you can find my stuff.
Awesome. Thank you again for taking the time, Evan. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.